and welcome back, or welcome to this session of the ISNTD Festival. For those who have just joined us, my name is Marianne Compred, and I'm speaking from the International Society for Neglected Tropical Diseases. I'm speaking here from London in the UK. We're here to conclude this festival with our book panel and really looking at writing about disease in all its forms. And it's our utmost pleasure today to be joined by two huge public health advocates. Professor Peter Hotez is here joining us. You are, of course, with, you have you're carrying lots of hats at the moment, so I suppose I'll just pick a few of those. You are Dean of the National School of Tropical Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, and you're also co-director of the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development. So hi, Peter, lovely to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Dr. Seema Yasmin, welcome. Again, a huge pleasure to have you here with us today. You are, it's quite hard to sort of summarize your background, author, journalist. You are also assistant professor in medicine at the University of Stanford. And you've been equally a very prolific author and also, like Peter, very present on social media.
Such an interesting question to respond to these days. It's kind of like I'm okay for a pandemic. I feel like the bereavements that myself and my family suffered were earlier, even around this time. Yeah, end of March, early April last year, I lost a friend to COVID-19. Then again in April, a friend died, and then I lost two family members a bit later. So it's felt like grief upon grief, and often with not enough time to process any one event. And then, of course, there's just the magnitude of grief around the world. So even if there are people who personally haven't lost family or friends, we all know somebody who has. And I think about, we'll talk a lot more about Ebola, but when I was in Liberia reporting on Ebola, one of the really difficult things that people were grappling with was how do you grieve and how do you mourn, especially when you weren't able to tend to the body in traditional ways, right? Especially for many Muslims, there were cremations. And one thing I learned was that many Liberians observe a national day of mourning. And I've just been thinking about that so much over the last year, especially before we had a new administration. We had an administration that just didn't even seem to reconcile or contend with the grief at all. And I still think, and I was thinking then, will we ever get time off to just stop and think about this magnitude of loss and suffering and to just really grieve? So that's what's been on my mind for the last 14 or so months.
Wow, that's absolutely sobering. And the parallels with many other outbreaks are absolutely valid and really striking. And how about yourself, Peter?
And even started to cry on national TV, which I never thought I would see myself doing. But when you're just talking about such incredibly sad things, it's hard not to. Then I found out that I was unusual for doing that, and so I think showing the world that it's okay for a scientist to feel emotion was actually refreshing for people as well, and so that is a big piece of the last 14 months, but also great privilege being able to talk to the nation and the world at times on a frequent and regular basis, but the responsibility that comes with it and the terror of getting it wrong in front of millions of people, there's a lot of intensity there, and then just the exhaustion from the work, because I'm still trying to be a working scientist, keeping up with the grants and the papers and the lab meetings, and we're accelerating a recombinant protein vaccine for COVID-19 and all the fundraising we had to do for it, and now it's being scaled up for production in India. So I would say, for me, it's also been a year of great meaning. It's been a very meaningful year for me in terms of being able to make a contribution scientifically, make a contribution to public health, to science communication, but also that heavy burden of talking about the massive loss of life that we've suffered in the United States and globally. And then, of course, the pressure of going to war with the White House, that I can't say that was fun. It was necessary, but being someone who's been going up against anti-vaccine groups for so many years because of my role as a vaccine scientist and the parent of an adult daughter, 4 adult kids, and one was an adult daughter with autism, early in the morning, either because of interview commitments or because we're doing phone calls with India and our collaborators there, or in Asia or in Europe, and then going to bed, with a late night, whether it's Don Lemon on CNN or someone else, and not sleeping much and trying to sleep when you can, and doing that for 14 months, a year of great intensity, I would say.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned emotion and talking about science. That's very much what's been at the heart of this festival, the discussions over the last 2 days, and particularly bringing in the issues of misinformation and also trying to convey information when actually there are huge unknowns. How have you found that balance between appealing to people, conveying kind of scientific reassurance, but at the same time with lots of unknowns and a lot of emotions coming into play? How as a scientist does one balance that? In particular, kind of opening this up to the fact you are both authors. What sort of skills and how do you juggle that?
I think my whole career trajectory has been grappling with exactly that, in that I was a hospital doctor in the UK, and then I moved to the US 10 years ago precisely because of epidemics, because I was so concerned about the increasing frequency and scale and magnitude. And so I came here to serve as an officer in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. And then the thing that I noticed was and I was deployed a lot. I was supposed to do my job with a singular focus on a microbe, when really it's this concurrent infodemic, this misinfodemic, misinformation and disinformation, rumors, health hoaxes, medical myths, all of those are spreading at the same time, that are making it really difficult, sometimes almost impossible, for me to do my job as an officer and to contain the epidemic. And that misinfodemic often fueled the outbreak. Oftentimes I arrived somewhere because there was a whooping cough epidemic, because people had not been vaccinating. And again, I was dealing with diseases like measles, mumps, and whooping cough in many cases, where as a medical student, I hadn't really seen those. I went to med school in 2005, and those were like, oh, those are diseases of like the olden times. We looked at black and white, hazy pictures in textbooks. And so I thought, this is really concerning, and this is such a massive threat to public health. It's unraveling decades of achievements that we've gained through vaccination and other interventions as well. And yet it was so frustrating to me that in public health, it was apparently okay to dismiss all of that and just concentrate on the pathogen as if that was the only thing that was harming people. Mm-hmm. And so again, to answer your question, I don't know if there is a balance, but what I did was I ended up taking a step away from public health for a while to go to journalism school, because I thought this was a problem of information, that I'm a public health physician, and yet I don't know how much attention we pay to the public part of that and the public facing part of that. We do a lot of our work at CDC at the time, like behind closed doors. And journalism school was really a way for me to train in storytelling. And how do you take uncertainty, as you mentioned in your question? How do you take all that nuance and complexity when epidemics are nearly always vastly evolving situations? How do you explain that? And how do you tailor messages to different groups of people based on their understanding, their historical context, their faith, for example, race, ethnicity? All of that plays into how we understand the world. And then I was a journalist for a while, I still am, and I came to Stanford as a John S. Knight Fellow in Journalism Innovation in 2017, exactly to study this, I've been doing trainings on this and had lots of examples of botched communications from public health agencies. And whoa, has the last 12 months, 14 months given me so much more material, unfortunately, of how we don't get it right, more so than the times when I think communication really is done in an efficient manner.
Yeah, and it's also that juggling that balance between what's going to actually catch the public's attention, and sometimes it's the really smaller things. You mentioned, Seema, the unraveling of public health gains, and I think that's something that's really close to your heart, Peter, particularly in terms of vaccination, the anti-vax movement, and also sort of in a more general sense. And so you've written a book about this quite recently. And so what kind of are you seeing in terms of misinformation and in terms of that loss of public health gains?
Yeah, well, first of all, to build on what Seema said, I think as I watched my colleagues or the White House Coronavirus Task Force on TV day in and day out, and then followed them or preceded them, the two errors that I saw in communication was, well, first, the less common one, which is the lapse into jargon. And that did happen, but the bigger problem was what I saw from the White House Coronavirus Task Force is they talk to the American people like they're in the fourth grade, like they're 12 years old or 10 years old. And I think a lot of that came out of schools of communications where 30 years back, before something called the internet came along, that's what they told people. That's how scientists had to speak at the sixth grade level. And it wasn't true. I mean, people didn't mind the complexity. You needed to be able to use straightforward language, but they liked hearing from scientists what their assumptions are and how they came to that conclusion. It was very protective because as the epidemic shifted, we learned more. You learned that some of the assumptions were incorrect. So when you had to reverse your statement, you were able to explain, yes, I said that, but that's because I had X, Y, and Z as my assumption. And people appreciated that. And I think if there are not many silver linings from this epidemic, but I think one is people liked what they heard from scientists. They don't necessarily like everything filtered through anchors and journalists. They don't mind hearing directly from the scientists. That was useful. I think the other piece, of course, to this epidemic was it was a 1-2 punch. Yes, it was the SARS coronavirus type 2, but at least in the US, it was a coordinated disinformation campaign. And people began tying their political allegiance to President Trump by defying masks and social distancing, and now they're defying vaccines. And that was an equal killer. It was death by COVID-19 and death by anti-science. And we saw that as the virus caused that horrible wave in the southern states last summer, and then after the surges spike, politicians do the politics. Well, I didn't do that. It was Larry Kudlow and people like Peter Navarro and Kayleigh McEnany and all those guys in the White House who were linked anti-science to the politics, and it was up to me to disentangle it, and I did. But it was a very scary place because that's where I lost a lot of backing from people, because what's Peter Hotez doing talking about all this political crap? He should be, just focusing on the science. But there was I couldn't figure out another way to disentangle the two without calling attention to it. And that, I was it was a bit of a crisis of confidence. And I remember my wife, Ann, said to me, she saw how upset I was getting. And she said, look, I mean, the last thing you want to have happen is by next year when the body count starts to go up, and you don't want to say you didn't do everything you could to save lives. And that's all I needed to hear. And it was tough in the beginning because the hardest part was not having the backing of the professional societies, the scientific societies, even the national academies, were silent. It's Martin Luther King once said, it's not the words of your enemies, it's the silence of your friends. Not that I'm comparing myself to Martin Luther King, but you get the idea. It was, I knew I was going to get the hate mail and the terrible emails and the awful stuff on social media. And that bothered me far less than the silence and just being out there, feeling very isolated and alone. Eventually, everyone came around and when it was safe, but that was tough in the early days. So I still have a little bit of PTSD from it all, but but I think now I've been writing and speaking. I know Seema has as well, about how we've mainstreamed anti-science and disinformation, and because now what we're seeing is what was a fringe element of the Republican Tea Party is now mainstream. You've got members of Congress defying masks and discrediting scientists. You have them refusing to take vaccines. So this is now a mainstream platform of the Republican Party, of the GOP in the United States.
And even
I mean, imagine like having the Labor Party or the Conservative, the Tories, having anti-science as their mainstream platform. I mean,
well, even though that is a very problem particular to the US, I think the COVID pandemic was interesting in that it's the first time that on this scale, politicians were making a lot of public health decisions, and so kind of the line between where that ended was very blurred.
I think that historically that's happened though, right? Because you look at Reagan and HIV, and even during COVID, you look at Bolsonaro and you look at other leaders in Eastern Europe or in parts of Africa as well, that anti-science, anti-public health messaging has long been there in some cases. It just really scaled up, I think, during the pandemic. And I actually have this really vivid memory of around this time last year, I'd just come off CNN. I was at a studio in San Francisco and I texted Peter and I was like, can I call you? And Peter was like, yeah, call me. And I remember ringing him up and saying, are you also like being told by public health agencies and folks that the misinfodemic is not such a big problem? Because I feel like, am I being gaslit here? Like, I don't understand. I've been studying this for years, and yes, it's been tricky. It's hard to get funding and support and just buy-in, to be honest, that this is a public health problem. And Peter was like, yeah, they've been saying it for years. And I was like, okay, because I started to question my scholarship, which I now do, and therefore just feeling like it's not our terrain. Let's ignore what communication scholars have been studying for 3 decades that says actually our traditional ways of doing science communications are quite ineffective and have very stark deficiencies. And so it was like, we just won't talk about that. But I remember calling Peter to be like, is it just me, or like what is happening? Because it was very disturbing. And even now, of course, there is more buy-in. We use the term misinfodemic. Everyone wants to talk about misinformation and disinformation, but when you look at actually how the problem is being countered and challenged, it's still not using evidence-based strategies. And it's still, oh, people are spreading this, we'll just make a pamphlet or a website that says that's not true, as opposed to meaningfully engaging with people.
That's right. So, I mean, I remember back in 2017, I wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times, which I think, when you write an op-ed piece, you usually don't get to pick the title as an editor. And the editor used a more strongly worded title than I would have picked, but it wasn't wrong. It was called How the Anti-Vaxxers Are Winning. That was the title in the New York Times. Mm-hmm. I got a call from some well-placed senior people in Health and Human Services, a Zoom call, and the Zoom call started out, Peter, we want to let you know we're not mad. And which of course meant they were mad as all hell, right? Right. So, and the message was, you're not supposed to call Peter. You don't call attention to this. You're just giving it oxygen. I said, really? I mean, it's like they were still living in a time when people had compact computers and dial-up. I mean, I said, where have you been? I said, this horse has left the barn. This train has left the station a long, long time ago. And to this day, the Health and Human Services Agency still cling to that we're not floating in the Atlantic Ocean. We're being buried by the dominance of the anti-vaccine, anti-science movements on the internet. And it's not only the Republican Party in the U.S. You've now got, it's been well reported by U.S. and U.K. intelligence that the Putin government is leading a whole systematic program of weaponized health communication. And I see that on a regular basis. And now you've got protests in European capitals against masks and vaccines. You had this in London at Trafalgar Square last summer, and in Berlin and Paris. They stormed the Reichstag. It was almost like the storming of our capital in the German parliament, and it was an anti-science rally. So I'm making the case now, and again, I'm an outlier here, that this is, I don't know what the exact term is, whether it's an anti-science confederacy or empire, but it's as great a threat as all the other movements that we build infrastructure to combat, like nuclear proliferation and terrorism. It's reached that status. And my evidence is the fact that 500,000 Americans lost their lives, partly through SARS-CoV-2. The other part, people deliberately define. And a nurse in the Midwest who weeping on TV because she's describing her the dying words of her intensive care unit patient who's, calling COVID a hoax as his last dying word, so he can't even die with dignity. So this is reached that status.
So Peter, your book is called Research Effort. Well, I can reassure you that whoever attended iSNTD Festival has got the message loud and clear, and particularly the neglected tropical disease community coming from a different angle, and it's more about reaching out to affected communities and giving patient voices. But there's really a movement which is seeking to bring in communication, the creative approaches, not so much as an add-on or an afterthought, but really embed that within the research and the kind of programmatic agenda. So that's the good news to reassure you. But just coming back to what can we do then when faced with these issues that you've highlighted. Peter, your book is serious prose, and it's about preventing the next pandemic. And at the other end, not of the spectrum, but in a kind of completely different way, Seema, your book, If God is a Virus, is a collection of poems. And so I just wanted to ask, why at this point have both of those books come into being? What was your very, most certainly very different, but at the same time, very similar kind of approaches? And how are they so different in form and format? Perhaps, Seema, we'll hear first from you.
So I did not think or know that the book would come out during a pandemic, although I think many of us in epidemiology were always anticipating the next pandemic. But I started writing this book in 2015 when I went to Liberia to report on the Ebola epidemic. At the time, I had finished my service in the Epidemic Intelligence Service. Then I'd gone to journalism school, not knowing exactly what I was going to do with that, knowing I still felt very much committed to public health. But I got a job offer as a newspaper reporter at the Dallas Morning News, which is how I first met Peter, in fact, because he was one of my sources. For of course, while I was still unpacking boxes, still moving into my home in Dallas, Ebola arrived in Dallas, because where else was the first imported case of Ebola ever going to arrive in the US? It, of course, had to be Texas. And so all my world collided, and I was reporting very much on what was happening in Texas. And the, what's a better word for hysteria? Because hysteria is really loaded, but there was a lot of xenophobia, there was a lot of anxiety, there was a lot of paranoia, so much of it founded on fear, not on really factual information. But then I also went to Liberia to report on not just people who had suffered Ebola, but people who had survived Ebola and were still being stigmatized because of that, because there was just this ignorance about what does it mean that you survived this often very deadly disease, and are you contagious to us? And I was really interested in that. And of course, I did my reporting. I wrote for Scientific American, Dallas Morning News, and other places. And I was, I guess, thinking about other ways to contend with the experiences I'd had, with the things I'd seen and the stories I'd heard. And I'd written some poems, and I read a lot of poetry. And I guess I started writing what we describe as documentary poetry, which are poems based on real life events. And as a reporter, I'd been observing keenly. I'd been embedding myself with the family. I'd been going to the weddings of Ebola survivors. I was totally enmeshed in lots of the research that was happening. A book of poems called Invasive Species. And one of these pages, and I have it in my book as well as kind of like a standalone, she says, poems do work, journalism can't. And so I was always thinking about, to me, the power of poetry is that it's an empathy machine. I think it has the potential to really help you understand someone's lived experiences, even if that person is 6,000 miles away, even if that person has survived 2 civil wars and an epidemic and you don't know what that feels like. I was less interested in the way that journalism often continues to other people. And as I'll read one of the poems to you later, I was also feeling, as a journalist myself, really concerned and critical about the ways that often we Western journalists, with all our privilege and our PPE, because remember, there were folks in Liberia treating Ebola patients without running water and without PPE. And we journalists from the West would arrive with all of that, but also helicopter in, tell stories and leave. And I was thinking about, how can I do more than that? Are there ways to hold power to account through poems? So yeah, that was some of my thought process. And of course, I started writing it in 2015, and Haymarket is publishing the book next month, not just while COVID is a problem, but while we have
preventing the next pandemic, vaccine diplomacy in a time of anti-science. And so why did you choose your format? Why a book? Why not an opinion piece or, different medium?
Yeah, I think, in some ways there's a little bit of overlap between our two approaches. What I actually started writing the book more than a year before COVID-19 hit, and it made the case that our global health infrastructure was eroding, even though we had made enormous progress since 2000 with the Gavi Alliance and the Post-Millennium Development Goals initiatives like PEPFAR and the Neglected Tropical Disease Program, which I was active with David Molyneux and Alan Fennick in helping launch and making great progress, but then a fraying or an unraveling starting about 5 or 6 years ago. And they were happening for things that we don't get training in either in medical school or in graduate school for biomedical sciences. It was war and political collapse and climate change and this rise in the anti-science and urbanization and deforestation. And I showed how they were combining in unique and interesting ways. So there's rising temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius, how that combines in interesting ways, or a 40-year drought in Venezuela with the socioeconomic collapse. And all of these things are, of course, stopping vaccination programs and neglected tropical disease programs, and identified about those half a dozen hotspots areas so that COVID-19 is less an extraordinary event and more a culminating event following unraveling that's been going on over the 5 or 6 years. And a lot of the book reports on how those forces operate to effect those changes. And then it makes some recommendations about what the new infrastructure we have to rebuild, but it also makes the case for training biomedical scientists and physicians. We have to make them aware of what's going on because there's no dialogue. There's no discussion between the biomedical scientists and the political scientists and the economists and sociology experts or people in the humanities. And I think, or it's a very uncomfortable dialogue and we don't quite know how to talk to each other. But I think that's an important theme is how we build those bridges in the academy. And unfortunately, it's not rewarded, especially around science communication. I mean, I don't know about Seema, but in my annual report, I get evaluated as well, even though I'm a professor and dean. And on my, annual report form, I have to list the speaking to the public. And the message that's handed down to us is that science communication and public engagement is a frivolous activity. It's not considered valued by the academic institution. And because, if let's say we were not living through the apocalypse right now, let's say this were a live event, I could promise you both Seema and I would have a small line of young people after our talk saying, hey, Dr. Hotez, Dr. Yasmin, I'm all in. How do I do this? And the problem, and because you have the commitment to public service among young people is at an all-time high. They want to do that engagement, but the ecosystem doesn't exist to even encourage it. And that's not just for doctoral and postdoctoral students; it's for faculty as well. Mm-hmm. It's considered risky to do that. And
I'm sorry, I've even heard of search committees penalizing people for public engagement in the sciences because they see it as a kind of, like you said, frivolous and not really contributing to the academy. It's archaic and a really bizarre way of thinking that continues to hurt us.
That's absolutely right. It's and actually discouraged. I mean, when I was getting my MD and PhD in New York back in the 1980s, there was a pretty strong message. You don't talk to journalists. Yeah. You don't talk to the public. That was seen as self-promotion or grandstanding, tone deaf to the fact that how the...
Well, as you say, the word shifting is pretty accurate, and things are moving very fast when it comes to science communication, obviously accelerated by something like COVID-19, where the race against, to share as much information as possible across a huge range of stakeholders, from governments to fellow scientists to the public to children in schools, you know, and you're trying to talk to everybody at the same time. So, and then across so many platforms, the WHO has been quite incredible in having something as simple as a daily briefing that journalists can quite easily tune in, and also posting material on Facebook and in a huge variety. So perhaps there is really we have really turned a corner when it comes to science communication. And
I feel cynical. I wonder how Peter feels most days, but we'll have to see if there's really meaningful and financial support of programs that not only study the health information ecosystem, but actually include communications training into our medical and scientific and our postgraduate training programs.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that's kind of where our event started, and we've kind of come full circle. So I don't know if the full circle brings in so many different kind of strands of science, of epidemiology, of thinking about outbreaks, and then kind of the poetry angle on it is very special. So as you say, Peter, if we were at a live event, there would be lots of young people. There would also be a very lovely table with your books displayed. We don't even have that. I mean, the best I can do is perhaps just share my screen so we can at least see the covers before Seema reads an excerpt from the book. There we are. So Peter Hotez, Preventing the Next Pandemic, Vaccine Diplomacy in a Time of Antiscience, and God is a Virus by Dr. Seema Yasmin. So having been the approximation of our lovely display table, hand over to you, Seema. We'd love to hear some of your poems.
I'll share 3 with you, and I can't wait for in-person events and literary events especially. So this is what the book looks like, and I'll read the first of 3 poems. It's called Disease is Not the Only Thing That Spreads. What else is contagious? Ellen's long tongue, a rumor we buried Daddy in an unmarked grave. History, pathogens crisscrossing agar-plated petri dishes like rebel soldiers breaching trenches. This story, that we had it coming, that we are good only for uncivil wars and diseases, that we prayed for colonization, blood, microbes escaping test tubes, conquering lab countertops slower than hearsay. She say we burned Daddy's corpse like bad Muslims, like white-coated doctors instructed. What else is contagious? Doctored death certificates, half-truths, cursive, ink, base end. And I'll read a poem called Liberia, Day Zero. Infection arrives on the black wing of the evening. Rusty spaghetti loops unfurl from nascent ampersands, slither into the crook of Mama's elbow, where Papa's head is cradled. Cooing as she rocks his neck, cry streams of SpaghettiOs onto Mama's good yellow dress. Papa's eyes streaked with bloody rivers, undammed capillaries forked and oozing, like the ones he crossed 2 coups ago, when Uncle hoisted boys onto sinking vessels. She boils potato greens, seasons stems with powdered bone and salt, sells them to the neighbor for malaria tinctures in case this new war can be fought with old medicine. Tomorrow she will sing, "Oh, Daddy, oh, rest in war." Crying into her chest, she will push her children out from her lap, stripping them of bonnets and gowns, stoke a bonfire, feed the flames with baby blankets, frocks, and all the scriptures, bent spines straightening in the flames. Pour kerosene and bless the paint stripper till it turns Zam-Zam water that she sips to lose count. 1 infected, 2 dead, 11,000 cremated on unholy pyres without ablution. Men in Tyvek suits and rubber boots walk over our cinders, she says. They dust our dead away. And I will read a 3rd poem, which was really my thinking about the way that journalists report on epidemics and public health crises. It's called All the News That's Fit to Print. Dark deaths employed to clean up their mess. Add 9 if babies are disintegrating in hollow graves. but restrict to 12 inches maximum. Even maple syrup tastes bitter licked off fingers inked with destitution. Buttercream pancakes stick in the throat, and it's all happening so far, far away. Follow the story with one reporter who knows nothing of PPE, shrouds, and ritual mourning. Send 4 photogs, overuse 2 underpaid local fixers if deadlines for awards are approaching. Win a Pulitzer for photos of brown faces eating expired medicines smeared in peanut butter aid. Say it is a gift from the American people. Say it was worth the ink. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very powerful. Yeah,
absolutely. I feel like I want to clap. I feel a bit lonely.
You can tell that I wrote that years before the pandemic because I was the PPE, thinking about reporters who didn't know what PPE is. Of course, everyone in the world knows what PPE is. And even at the time, I was like, should I just leave it as PPE? People would be like, what does that stand for? So it's interesting how things change and our vocabulary grows as well.
Absolutely, particularly this time around, it's just been a complete volte-face of public knowledge of science. Those poems were incredible. Thank you for sharing them with us, Seema. I think we've talked a lot about how the creative, thanks for that. So, I mean, we've heard your message loud and clear. No to infodemics and misinformation and the critical need for better training, but also framing of the scientists' messages to the bigger audience.
But I think the other thing that and this is how I end part of the book, is to talk about the need for better global governance around this. We have to stop pretending it doesn't exist, and I've been calling on the Biden administration. It was fruitless in the last administration, but in the Biden administration to create an interagency task force to really look at how we're going to manage this, because it's gone beyond just the health sector. It's a homeland security threat to the country. We have to bring the Justice Department, Commerce Department. We have to bring in the State Department to do something about the Putin-led Russian government. And I've had that same discussion about the UN agency level, that we need to recognize this as a global threat, as big as anything else that we combat, and bring in the different UN agencies to address it. Otherwise, it's going to continue to grow and flourish, I'm afraid.
Right. Well, we knew that inviting both of you, Peter and Seema, was going to just kind of bring up a huge number of issues. I feel like we've only just barely touched upon the surface. However, we're coming up to the end of our time today for this book panel. Just really wanted to thank you both in the chat for where to obtain such a copy. If there are any final words you'd like to leave our attendees, they've all been really inspired by what you've said. Rod Dillon from Lancaster University here in the UK saying very releasing. Oluwatife Aderunmu, who was speaking earlier on from the University of Ibadan, a medical student, said beautiful. Helen, I think I know which Helen you are, perhaps from the University of Kiel, Science and Poetry, amazing. Cameron Rafiq, my colleague, power to you. Naomi Marks clapping, and Rod Dillon again saying it's very refreshing to hear from scientists instead of politicians talking directly to the public. So anyway, thank you. We've really enjoyed our time with you.
Thank you.
And we hope to obviously be following you, keeping an eye on all the outlets numerous outlets that you're on, and we hope to see you very soon again.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
So take